All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I've been coming at you with a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College AWD Application and Web Development 1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class. The main textbook for the class is scheduled to be ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Mr. Lee Naylor. Before going through that book though, because although it's very code intensive, some of the explanations are not stellar. So what I plan on doing first is to go over the textbook Professional ASP.NET MVC5 by John Galloway of Microsoft and others. All right, and I will do this, or I have been doing this. I'm in the middle of chapter 4 and actually towards the end of chapter 4. So we've done getting started, controllers views, and we're finishing up models right now. And I'm on about page 103. So there's about 5 or 6 pages left in this chapter. We are up to the section on model binding, which I believe is the last section in the chapter. And the author says here, imagine you implemented the edit action for an HTTP post and you didn't know about any of the MVC features that you can use to make your life easier. Because you're a professional web developer, you realize the edit view is going to post form values to the server. If you want to retrieve those values to update an album, you might choose to pull those albums in directly from the request. So the author says you might want to do something like this. Notice they're all request.form, and you grab everything from there. And if there were a lot of things, and let's face it, some of the forms that you could potentially fill out on the internet could have a lot of fields in them. So the author says, as you can imagine, code like this can become tedious. I've only shown the code for 2 of the properties. You've got 4 or 5 more to go. And if you had a complex in a form, again, you could have even more than that. You have to pull each property value out of the form collection and move those into an album property. Any property not of the type string will require some kind of a conversion to take place. So it says, fortunately, the edit view carefully named each form input to match with an album property. So there is a direct correlation between the form name and the name that you have in code, thus the name that will be in the database. If you remember the HTML we looked at earlier, the input for the title had the name title, the input for the price had the name price, etc. You could modify the view to use different names, but doing so would only make the action code more difficult to write. All right. If the input names match the property names, it says there, why can't you write a generic piece of code that pushes values around on a naming convention? And that's what model binding does. So, as mentioned, instead of digging the form values out of the request, the edit action simply takes an album object as a parameter right here. So if we go back to our code and we look in here, we look at our store manager controller, edit. Remember, this was the get, so this is the post. It's not a very big, when you look at this, it's not a very big routine. But the key line that we're going to look at in here right now is this. All right, at least to start with. Hit enter a couple times and break up a little bit of room for us here. Okay, so let's go back to our text and take a look at what the author says here. When you have an action with a parameter, the MVC runtime uses what's called a model binder to build the parameter. You can have multiple model binders registered in the MVC runtime for different types of models, but the workhorse by default will be the default model binder. In the case of an album object, the default model inspects the album, finds all the properties available for binding. Following the naming convention, the default model binder can then automatically convert and move values from the request into an album object. So again, Look at it this way. What we're doing is we're grabbing what we put into the form, we're validating it, and if it's been validated, we're saying we're about to move it into the database. All right, that's my verbiage, and the author says here, in other words, when the model binder sees that an album has a title property, it looks for a value named title in the request. Notice the model binder looks in the request and not in the forms collection. It uses the components known as value providers to search for values in different areas of the request. It can look at route data, the query string, the form collection, wherever it needs to. You can also add custom value providers if you so desire. Model binding isn't restricted to HTTP post operations, as it says here on the bottom of page 104. It can also feed primitive parameters into an action, such as the edit action. In the scenario that's shown right here, so if we look at the action result for the edit, well, I guess that is where we were. All right. The author says here, all right, such as the edit action to responding to an HTTP GET request. So let's back up and go back up to the GET, and there it was. Now remember that question mark, okay? And it's interesting because we're going to come across this again in the spring 2019 semester when we talk Java and when we talk Kotlin. That question mark basically means that it is possible for the value of the ID to be null, and that's considered to be legitimate. That could happen if you hadn't selected anything, or maybe it was the first time you're running through this. So in this scenario, as the author says here on the bottom of 104, going on to page 105, the model binder uses the name of the parameter, which is ID, to look for values in the request. The routing engine is the component that finds the ID value, but it is a model binder that converts and moves the value from the route data into the ID parameter. So it's a lot of this stuff, for lack of better words, is kind of happening. It's not behind the scenes, but you can kind of look at it that way because things are happening for you automatically. They say here that the model binder is like a search and rescue dog. The runtime tells the model binder it wants the value for the ID, and the binder goes off and looks everywhere to find a parameter with a name ID. Now they talk about it a little bit more in here. I'm not going to go through this. It's going to be probably very rare that I'm going to go through in depth a lot of these gray things where they give a little bit of extra information. I just want to finish this up. I've got about 2.5 more pages here. So explicit model binding on the bottom of 105 and going on to 106 and 107. Model binding implicitly goes to work when you have an action parameter. You can also explicitly invoke model binding using the update model and the try update model methods in your controller. Update model throws an exception if something goes wrong during the model binding and the model is invalid. Here is what the edit action might look like if we used an update model instead of the action parameter. All right, they show this on the bottom of 105, and most of it is actually in page 106 because notice we've got a try statement where we're trying to call that. So we're doing the same type of operation. The big thing though here is it's another way of doing something. Now, be this good, bad, or indifferent, the author is talking about 2 or 3 different ways of doing the same thing. I applaud the author trying to be complete, but I would suggest, us just keeping with the code that was generated for us as we start. So we did the update model, and if it doesn't work, okay, we've got the catch statement, which means if for some reason it's invalid, we're just going to do exactly what we did before. Try update model does the same thing, except it doesn't throw an exception. It returns a Boolean value, true, false. A value of true, meaning the binding succeeded and the model is valid, and the value rather of false if something went wrong. Now, they mention on the bottom of page 106 and going on to page 107, it says a byproduct of model binding is model state. For every value the model binder moves into a model, it records an entry in model state. You can check model state anytime, all right, to see whether or not it's succeeded. So you can call it, and then you can see if the model state was valid or not. All right? So again, plenty of ways of doing the same thing. Two options for restricting model binding. I'll let you read that yourselves on the page, the middle of page 107. Now, the author mentions here, as we just about finished with the chapter, if any errors occurred during model binding, model state will contain the name of the properties that caused the failures, the attempted values, and the error messages. Although model state is useful for your own debugging purposes, it's primarily used to display error messages to users so you can indicate why something failed. In the next two chapters, the author says we will show how model state allows HTML helpers and MVC validation features. Chapter 5, which is on HTML helpers, Chapter 6, which is on data annotation and validation, to work together with model binding. So, to summarize, on the bottom of 107 and the top of 108, in this chapter, we focused entirely on models and model objects. As it says, you can write the definition for your models using C# code, and then use scaffolding to add the controller, and depending on how much you want to add, all right, most, if not almost all of the associated views. Out of the box, it says all of the scaffolding works with the entity framework, but scaffolding is extensible and customizable, so you can have scaffolding work with a variety of technologies. We also ended the chapter by looking at model binding, and we even looked at different ways of achieving model binding. The author mentions that they made a brief mention of the consequences of model binding too much data, which will be discussed again in Chapter 7, which is on authentication, authorization, and security. A key takeaway here is exactly what they say at the end here. So I'm at the end of Chapter 4, on the last paragraph on page 108 of the text. We've only scratched the surface of understanding how model objects can drive an application. All right, as we continue on with this text, we'll see how models and their associated metadata can influence the output of HTML helpers. Again, that'll be the next chapter, and affect validation, which will be the chapter after that. So next on, we're going to go into forms and HTML helpers. That is about a 25-page chapter. And I do want to mention, I don't know so much in both these chapters. In the next two chapters, it is literally not going to be possible, probably, for me to go over, and it won't, every single HTML helper there is, every single data annotation there is. All right, there's even a ton of them just in the chapters. So I'm going to hit the high points, or what I consider to be the high points. Whether that's right or wrong, I guess we'll find out as we go on. Okay, so I'll be back to begin the lecture on Chapter 5 forms and form helpers very shortly.